So I'm back. I took a hiatus to campaign and to refrain. Yes, I've been a little gun shy. You've never heard this from my lips in 3 years, but the climate whereby people interpret things the way they want to instead of the way the speaker intended or the way everybody around except you with a blinders on intend has become really poisonous. It's worth fighting. And to some extent, I'm fighting it here because certainly some critique of a cherished book is bound to draw some ire. Well, bring it on, because this cherished book is bad. It has so many wrongs and misleads people that it deserves discussing. So I am back. I'm in chapter 2, where a good definition is brought forth, and that's worth discussing. I will do that at length. It's a definition from David Wellman, succinctly summarizing racism as, quote, a system of advantage based on race. Now, I don't like that definition. I would agree that that might be a definition of systemic racism, but I think racism has a much more individualized term and a much more serious term if somebody is indeed practicing racism. When a system is practicing it, harder to point the finger at any one evildoer. And if this definition holds, that is a system of advantage based on race, it is not true in the United States. It has not been true for at least 40 years. Don't talk about systemic racism against blacks or other minorities if you're talking about the present day. That is one of the bigger problems with this book. Richard Rothstein's book at least puts things into the right perspective. There was racism. It had bad effects. It is largely over. This woman, Robin DiAngelo, doesn't acknowledge that, and it leads to bad consequences. Now, she contends that, quote, these advantages are referred to as white privilege. Okay, I can accept that if you were living in such a system of advantage based on race. Well, South Africa, up until Desmond Tutu took over, that would be a proper designation. The southern U.S. until the civil rights movement, that would be a proper designation. It's still proper in some countries, and it goes to the disadvantage of whites, okay? Japanese are advantaged versus all others when you're in Japan. In certain African countries, whites in the minority have systemic lack of privileges that blacks have. Arab countries include that as well. And this goes to a problem of generalization. Generalization is bad. It is bad argumentation, and Ms. DiAngelo does it frequently. It comes up on page 25 of chapter 2 when she says, whiteness rests upon a foundational premise, the definition of whites as the norm or standard for human, and people of color as a deviation from that norm. Well, that can't be true, okay? White Americans know that whites are a minority worldwide. Asians are half of the global population. And in India, in Pakistan, in China, whites are such a minority. The textbooks rarely will mention white achievements, the cultural significance of white music, white composed artistry is really minimalized. It's not the norm worldwide. Why might it be the norm in the US and not be based on racism? Because US history has been populated by white people, more than 80% of the population, and the significant achievements that we remark on, okay, And that's what history does. They rarely talk about ordinary. They talk about the more extraordinary inventions, leaders, government officials. And in part because of racism, that has been 90% of American history. But that is not the fact that American history books will have 80 or more percent talking about whites is not a racist publisher. It is a recognition that this is the status. And reciprocally, though I have not opened up a Kenyan or Nigerian textbook, I am quite certain that whites would have no more than 50%. And even if they got that high, those two countries were greatly influenced by Anglos from the British Empire. Go to Tanzania, okay? Go to Zimbabwe, it's certainly going to be less. Generalizing is a bad thing. And it's especially bad when the heft of one's argument, like D'Angelo, is that since so much is unfairly white, we are racist. So much is not unfairly white. Stop calling us racist. Now, we are no longer a government-based segregation society. To a small extent, we actually have race-based privileges that favor blacks. Small. So that's 40 years in the past. If a white privilege exists in private commerce, private society in the United States, it is so hush-hush that whites, they have to be quiet rather than be overt. They then suffer not a privilege, but the opposite, that they can't even speak their minds because the good members of society around them have come to demand equity in people's feelings for other races. White privilege, thus, I don't think exists. Not in the United States in 2020. There are some privileges that do exist. And to the extent that one thinks, gee, there's such privilege for being born white, I'll tell you what makes you far more privileged in America 2020 than skin color. Being born with an intact two-parent household who stay together. That is a privilege that unfortunately many kids don't have. Another, that you had the privilege of attending a private school, usually better education and some values that come out of it. You had the privilege of growing up with little or no crime in your neighborhood. These are far more important privileges than the skin color privilege that Robin DiAngelo claims exists. And I think if it does, it is minuscule at best.